So, Grant, if you would kind of lead off and, introduce yourself, tell me a little bit more about the foundation, and then just kind of start off with the story of how this issue has recently involved y'all and what you do.
Well, thanks for having me. This issue, when it happens to you, you become passionate about it, and you learn a lot more about the issue. So our foundation is called the Miles Foundation. We focus primarily on education, grant making in the DFW area. Our founder left his estate, and we manage his assets, making investments, and then we also give it away. So the give it away part, which comes into play in this case in some ways, really focuses on just Fort Worth ISD in that area a lot. And the foundation's been around, I don't know, about 15 years or so now. And so we're there, we're giving away money. So we make an investment, and we buy, with some partners, we buy a building, and it is in the Fort Worth Independent School District boundary. And we rehab the building, we take it out to market, we're entertaining offers. The Fort Worth ISD, who we give money to, by the way, they come in and they are interested, and we think this is great, this would be a perfect fit for them. They have $800 million budget. This sounds like this would be a good buyer for us. And they're looking for a place to do a technology center, and so they're out looking. And we tell them, well, we don't really want to sell it, we want to lease it to them. And they said, well, we don't want to lease it, we want to buy it. So we came up with a price, and they didn't like the price. And we went back and forth, and they said, well, you know what, I think it's probably better. We're just going to take it via eminent domain. And so, yeah, this starts the battle. And the case that we're talking, the film today, I guess the Kilo case, we get into it with the lawyers, and they're saying you shouldn't fight the taking. This is not really worth the fight because it's kind of settled. So we think, all right, well, we're going to work on just trying to get them to pay us a fair price, this just compensation. And so the price that we were looking for and the price they offered were just, they're a wide range, from $5 million to $2 million. And we weren't even really going to recover the money we had in the project. So we take it to the next phase, and I'm going to get some of the details, I'm going to skip over some, but we take it to the next phase of the process, and the county says, we think it's worth a little bit more money, but still nowhere near what we were asking. So we sue the Fort Worth ISD. The same people on one day were giving money to and supporting students within the district, and trying to create a really good educational environment. The same people are over here taking the property from us. And we went through a whole year-long legal battle, and ended up settling with them for much less than what we wanted to settle, or what we wanted to sell the property for. And I can get into details if you want, but I don't want to dominate the panel. But we got less than, way less than what we wanted to. It was a really unfair process. We weren't allowed to put in to evidence some really key facts, and it's just really set up in the government's favor.
Let me ask one of those key facts that I know you mentioned to me. Was, I think, you told me that in the scope of the litigation it came up the appraisal district value.
Yeah.
And how did that play out? What was that issue, and how did that play out when you were trying to get just and fair compensation for this?
Right, so we're thinking this whole time, well, we pay taxes on almost $4 million. So surely we're going to get at least what we've been paying taxes on. And so we go, they offered us $2 million, and so we're $4 million. This is the same people that appraised the property for us to pay taxes on. So we go to court, and we weren't allowed to bring that piece of evidence in. So the jury doesn't ever know that we've paid taxes on $4 million. We don't get to use that fact in this case. So we're basically their appraiser versus our appraiser, and really it's who's the most credible. By the way, we pay all our legal fees with no chance of being reimbursed, and so it's really set up for big people with lots of money. I think, imagine if this was a low-income family, or a senior on fixed income, or a veteran, or somebody that really doesn't have the ability to fight, that can't put $100,000 or $200,000 towards a fight, they have no chance, right? We had a little chance because we at least fought them and were able to get the number higher. But even then, we had the resources to fight, and it was still just really stacked against us.
You know, I want to segue over to Austin's story, but I think Grant, and we'll come back and have a discussion on this, but give some context more about your foundation and the type of projects that y'all fund. Not only in this situation was it a lower price than you felt that you were entitled to, but I would expect that the proceeds that you would have realized from this, you guys would have done more with. So
sure. We don't take the profit. We don't take any of the profits home. This isn't my business, not my money. So we manage this foundation. The money goes to reading programs within the school. They go to pre-K within Fort Worth ISD and other outside the district. But it's really trying to start kids off on the right track. We focus a lot on the 0 to 8-year-old kids, and these are preparing young minds to go into school and really set the district up for success. And they don't really care about that. And they really tried to separate. This is a game they play where the superintendent, a lot of people just act like they don't know anything that's going on. It's really just a business office, and so they confuse the issue, and no one really knows who's doing what. And so we tried to use a little influence that, hey, we give you guys money, don't you remember that? And none of that mattered. That's the business office, and we don't really get into those issues. So they really box you out. You really can't do much about it.
How did it work? Last question. How did it work in the negotiation, just to give an idea of the context? So, did they came and said, hey, we want to buy it, and you guys set a price, and they go eminent domain? Or, did you guys negotiate for a while and just get to, gridlock and then, or, was it the immediate reaction, or was it that they just, got tired of trying to negotiate and went that way? What was your impression on how that came into play?
So we don't know everything they were doing on the other side, but so they were also looking at another property, very similar, in a different part of town. And this wasn't like a new campus for a school. This was their technology center, could have been anywhere in the city, which sort of the whole purpose of eminent domain was at least in my opinion, was we had no other option. We really had to take your property. They just could have picked anywhere. They could have built their own building on land, but they didn't do the preparation. They didn't plan ahead. They needed space. They just took ours. So the negotiation was we wanted a lease. They wanted to buy. We said, we'll lease to you for a year, and then you can buy it from us. They said, okay. So the price came in. They didn't like it. I think something happened with the other property, didn't come through, and there was no negotiation. They didn't need to. They wanted to get what they could, to pay the price they wanted to pay. There was no one's going to pay the price, for them lowballing us. Matter of fact, if they paid us full price, they would have probably somebody would have not been happy with them. So they paid us as low as possible. It wasn't any really tough negotiation. It wasn't even that contentious. They knew they weren't going to get anywhere. They just skipped the process and just went ahead with eminent domain. It was a little negotiation, but not a whole lot. So,
Grant, thank you for sharing your story with us and the story of your foundation. Arif, why don't you introduce a kind of a local issue on the same topic?
Yeah. Look, eminent domain can be easily abused, as you've seen. It can be abused with just compensation. It can be abused with the taking. And I think Austin's situation highlights two of those things. Both the idea that you're going to take property, the government that is, with really no plan until you take the property and then figure it out later. Pretextual takings, a big problem in this country. And this lowballing issue, where you have one side armed with unlimited resources, they can lawyer up all they want, and they have this huge power to just take your land, versus the property owner who just wants just compensation. And so, tell us what happened.
So in our particular situation, and it's funny to read the stories that have been printed in the press on our particular case, and oftentimes they were framed as a David versus Goliath, often portraying some of the neighborhood groups as the David and me as Goliath, which is ironic because in this particular situation, we have the power of the government coming after an individual citizen. At the time that we purchased this property in March of 2015, I was still a pharmacist at Target. I have been a real estate investor. I've been a realtor since 2000 and had kind of moved on I was only working probably 20 hours a week as a pharmacist in the healthcare industry and trying to be a small business owner, and invested for a property in Montopolis area in March 2015. We paid $262,000, somewhere in that range, for that particular property, and I'm only saying the number because it's been printed in the press at this point. The county itself has the date of this structure being the year built is 1968, and so.
So pause right there. So you
Right.
bought a piece of land,
Right.
and on it there's a structure that was kind of boarded up.
A boarded up building. The previous owner is a gentleman who owns Montopolis Supply, which is a metal supply warehouse. And so the building had actually been preserved in the sense that it's been cladded in sheet metal for the last 30 years. He had previously been the deacon of a church at that facility, and they had all collaborated, bought additional property elsewhere. That parish had closed down, and so they had moved. And so the building's been boarded up since somewhere in the early 80s, as far as we can go back. There's still Statesman papers inside with Farrah Fawcett on the cover. It's LA's new hit, Austin Girl. And my wife and I have a copy of it in our living room, which cracks me up. So the building has functionally been mummified since for the last 35 years.
So you weren't going to use the building. What was the vision then for the property?
So we had several options. One was that we were like, well, the building's actually been relatively well conditioned, so we could maybe do something with it. However, the zoning of this particular site in Austin is SF3 or single family, and so that would have to change. So plan A was, we could go in and try and find a way to rezone the property, which would have to go through the neighborhood groups, or we could apply for a demo permit, tear it down, and just do a single family development through the site. We set a meeting. At this time, we had just had our first son, and we went to the meeting, and functionally were laughed out of the meeting by some of the neighborhood groups and said, there's no way we're going to offer to rezone it. And by the way, we think this building's historic, and you have no right to own it. It is a sign of racial injustice from years back, and we want it to become a museum to rectify that, and it has to be on your dime. In other words, we're sorry, but that's exactly what's going to happen in their opinion. So we decided to proceed down the road. We didn't really dig into the history at that meeting. It was it was contentious, to say the least, and so we just left. Proceeded to try and develop the site as a single-family site. Went through a 9-month process of historic designation, and were able to successfully obtain a demo permit from the city of Austin. During that process, and at the time, ironically, of the situation is that Reef was actually one of the commissioners on the board at the time, and so we had filed we had filed a valid petition that said that it required a supermajority for that commission to force historic zoning on us as the owners against our will. And during our testimony, we were very clear: we're willing to preserve it, but we have to be willing to, because exactly what was going to happen is that they wanted to make sure that they forced historic zoning on the property against our will. And then at that point, they would leave us with no other option than to sell, because they were not going to support a rezone to allow us to do something with the structure. Their intent was to prevent us from being able, pretextually prevent us from being able to do anything functional with the structure, because at this point, it's not going to be a single-family house.
So no houses around the area?
No houses, yeah. And once we actually obtained the demo permit, we decided to go to city staff, city council members, the mayor, and worked at length and spent quite a bit of money coming up with our own plan to try and redevelop the site. And we decided to maybe make the site itself, or the historical site, a banquet facility of some sort that could be accessible to the public. Also for private event reservation, but it could be donated to public groups, however, if they wanted to use it for historic education. And then we were going to do some additional commercial development around there, and we had full support of both zoning staff as well as several council members, including my council member of District 1 East, which is Houston, and then the resident council member of this particular district, which is Pio Renteria. And we proceeded forward with the plan, which was approved unanimously for historic preservation by the Historic Landmark Commission. And then we stalled at the Planning Commission. The Planning Commission decided to make this a social justice issue, and at that point, they voted against our plan. And this put the mayor and several council members in awkward positions, and they asked if we'd be willing to sell it. I said, absolutely. And this goes back to the discussion of both public use and just compensation. and we didn't really have a number in mind. And at that point, they initiated their own appraisal. This is what blows me away about eminent domain is that, being a Texan, growing up in Texas, I always had this perception of Texas being this property rights are sacrosanct. I mean, and it is the one thing that can never be touched. And I have been baptized by fire over the last years and shocked at the broad width. As long as city council can vote, or a municipality can vote publicly on how to do this, they have the incredible breadth to be able to do what they want. And what's even more amazing is that when they vote to, despite the fact that we've gone to extensive efforts to try and work with them, including investing personally in a preservation effort that we have no need to do. We have a valid demo permit to this date, yet we've continued to try and work in good faith, nothing shows a lack of good faith when you try and actually subvert the negotiations with alternative motives. And the reality is that eminent domain should exist. It needs to, but it needs to be used wisely and prudently. I mean, I see it almost like nuclear weaponry, right? How are we to use it? And that you would think that the judgment when using it would be something other than just for political gain.
Yeah. And what's particularly striking, and correct me if I'm wrong, is you agreed to have a historic designation after all of this. Mm-hmm. The city staff agreed with your plan, including the designation.
They were actually the applicant on the plan.
They applied, right, so the plan goes up to council, it's on the agenda, the applicant is the city of Austin. And then all of a sudden, an agenda item pops in on the same exact agenda, and that agenda item was exercising eminent domain from the same property. So you've got the city saying, let's approve this and move along, and at the same time, you've got more of the political forces wanting, let's just take this property to make a museum. And what's particularly striking is that the discussion on that item occurred after midnight, really late.
It was near 1 in the morning.
You want to see how tight-lipped council members can be? Watch that tape. They didn't want to answer what their plan was, just that it was going to be a museum. There was a question on the dais about the funding, very tight-lipped. We'll figure it out later. And the problem is that you can't take and figure it out later. If you're going to use eminent domain, it's the last resort. You have a plan, you've gone through everything, and then maybe if there's a public use. But here, there's elections going on, and this totally looks like the exercise of eminent domain just because politicians have that raw power and decided to appease some kind of interest group. And after the fact, later, we just found out recently that the cost of the city to preserve this thing as a museum,
hidden in a hidden memo,
$5 million.
with 5.7 within a Parks Department memo. What was written on the actual public statement, where anybody could weigh in on it, was $362,000, which is a laughable sum in today's market for an acre of land in East Austin, and so that is what everyone voted on. But they can hide the actual cost to taxpayers within it. Not to mention the fact that my plan costs taxpayers nothing. Actually, the taxpayers would get paid $182,000 for the right-of-way that goes through our site, which is it is just a testament to not only the abuse of eminent domain in wielding it as some sort of political cudgel, but really it's just disappointing that. As a taxpayer and as we approach January where we all pay our property tax bills, it's just a reminder, and I've had several discussions with friends as Prop K comes up, which is the requested audit of our city books, and when you see items like this, you wonder how you could argue against it.
It's a particularly outrageous use of eminent domain. There's political gain underscoring this, there's no question. And it's intellectually indefensible. And the city itself applied to approve a plan where they'd have a landmark, they'd have private investment in a structure that they care about. They wouldn't be taking someone's land against their will. And the people would be able to use a nice property and have some affordable housing on top of that and some commercial structure.
And they pretend to care about it, but at the same time, they've left it vacant for almost 40 years.
Yes.
And so I think it's interesting that it's just as if we start to make movement in one direction, then all of a sudden, the brakes stop.
What happened?
So at this point, I'm still under a lawsuit with the city of Austin, what's interesting is you go back to the just compensation argument. This is obviously not a criminal case, but I think everyone has an expectation of swift justice. The way that eminent domain process works is that you have these special commissioners courts where independent jurists are just to help determine and arbitrate the value. Each party, so I would hire my own appraiser, which we've done, and then they would hire their own appraiser, which is their $362,000 number. And then we would meet at a special commissioner's hearing, and then we can appeal beyond that. The problem is I literally can do nothing with it in the interim. This first started, I think, at the Planning Commission back last spring. And so we've been unable to do anything. We have applied for our special commissioner's court hearing, and the city gets back to us, and they want to extend it until January 22nd of 2019. So we continue to have carry cost, opportunity cost. We literally have to do nothing with it. It seems like a strikingly unfair process, particularly when we've negotiated in good faith throughout the entire time, despite the fact, and we still continue to enjoy the possession of a demolition permit, but our goal is not demolition. We could, I've been advised by council to just tear the building down tomorrow, but that's not what our goal is. Our goal is to preserve it and to do it in a respectful manner, privately, and not do it on the backs of the taxpayers of Austin, just so that certain politicians locally can have a political win.
Well, Reef, I think that's a great segue for you to kind of set up what's coming next.
Yeah. Well, these examples are outrageous, but they're happening all across the country. And the story that you're going to see in Little Pink House is one of the big inflection points in the battle against the abuse of eminent domain and the battle to secure property rights as our Constitution requires the government to do, to secure our rights, not to violate them like they're doing. We started litigating eminent domain cases years ago, and the story that you're hearing is the lead up to the 2005 case at the US Supreme Court, Kelo versus City of New London. And the issue there, just in a nutshell, without spoiling the story, is there had been thousands of documented examples that IJ had worked on across the country where the use of eminent domain was used to take land out of private hands only to hand it over to another set of private hands for the purpose of economic development. That's not public use, but that's the issue that got bubbled up all the way to the US Supreme Court. The backlash that occurred after the Kelo case led to significant reforms. 47 states either amended their constitution or passed laws, and you'll see why when you see this story, to stop the use of eminent domain for private gain. But another thing that it did is make clear to everyone that if there's any ambiguity in any kind of statute that confers eminent domain power, that it's construed in favor of the property owner. And I think, in my view, that extends also on the just compensation side. This is a story about a taking. And after a taking, there's just compensation. And if there's ambiguity between one offer versus another, it has to be construed in the property owner's favor, because we need those structural protections in place, because not everyone can litigate a Kelo case up to the US Supreme Court. And we demand from our government that the structural protections are in place, whether they're in the just compensation phase or the takings phase, where they have a plan before they exercise eminent domain as a last resort. But as you'll see today, it had gone so far off the rails that they were just literally taking land just to hand it to private developers. And that's not a legitimate use of government power. Suzette Kelo, along with other homeowners, are homeowners that we represented. Her story is compelling. I think it speaks to why this fight has to be continued, why when there's examples of other issues that remain, other abuses that remain, because make no mistake, the only thing is that folks are getting more creative with their use of eminent domain for private gain, sometimes political gain, and what have you. And the goal at IJ and at TPPF is just to keep pushing things forward in a pro-liberty direction, holding the government accountable, and we're always inspired when there's property owners that are willing to tell their story, stand up, push back, add transparency, and really lift the veil on what's really happening across the country. So the movie's going to be wonderful. I hope you enjoy it. I can't wait to see my colleagues on the screen. And a big thanks to Austin and to Grant as well.
So, yeah. I hope our goal for this has been, and we're not going to have time for questions with this, with showing the movie, but our goal for this has been to contextualize this issue and make it relevant to us here in Texas, us here in Austin, of examples where this is coming up, in today's political environment, today's government. And, I want to thank Austin, I want to thank Grant for being here, for being on this stage, for sharing their story, and for being vocal on this issue. And it really helps, I think, for us to see why this movie matters when we can see how this issue matters to Texans who are dealing with it now, today, in 2018. So real quick, guys, thank you for being here. If y'all just help me to thank our panelists.